let's all hold hands and go back into the Wayback Machine here for a moment. 2019. This is before Bill Shorten earned, what, $750,000 running a university? Back then, he wanted the lowly job of being the Prime Minister of the country. Now, of course, he was Chloe Shorten's husband. Never forget the single most important thing, apart from when he used to run and have those little T-Rex arms and the man boobs. Hey, I got them too, but I don't have the T-Rex arms. Now, he, of course, believed climate change, desperately important. It was, as Kevin Rudd had said before, the problem of our ages. And his plan was to cut the emissions in the country by 45%. Australia said no, because he couldn't put a price on how much the cost of transition would actually cost. You may remember.
Thanks very much. And now Mark's going to talk.
All right. Thanks very much. Any questions for me?
Mr Albanese, will your deficit be higher or lower than the coalition? We've asked now over 2 days 10 questions. Can you give us an answer?
I don't want to disappoint you for Thursday.
No, well, you've got an opportunity to be honest with the Australian people.
We will, and we will put it out on Thursday.
So will you also sign up to a treaty with the WHO on the pandemic management? Can you answer honestly about that?
Isn't there a problem with transparency?
We're following you for answers, Mr Albanese, and you're now just not giving them. You have to answer eventually.
Another example of Jonathan's work, but you remember the original from 2019. What's it going to cost, sir? What's it going to cost? Well, the cost of not doing anything would not be enough. Well, Australia said, no, sorry, put a number on it, or we're not interested. Lesson learnt by Albanese and Bowen in the 2022 election. So in the lead up to it, they turned around and said, you know what, 45% climate target, that was going to be too difficult, so we're going to do a 43% target. We're also going to promise hundreds of thousands of jobs by 2030. Oh, yeah, and then this to make sure that no one would be worried about an increase in your power bill.
Reducing power prices by $275.
Reducing power prices by $275.
By 2025, $275 a year.
$275 a year.
We'll get power prices down by $275 a year.
$275 for the average house, lower in 2025 than today.
It was a lie. It was always a lie. But then because the media loves the liars in this case, well, it was all just based off, someone forgot to carry the one. That was 2022 numbers. Don't worry, it doesn't really apply to now. When all of us knew, anyone who's been around this conversation for as long as we has been, is that the cost of transition means to go from what has been the system to a new system, and the new system has to be built from scratch. We knew that would cost hundreds of billion, almost $1 trillion. The CSIRO was saying that a few years ago. Now they say it's the best part, again, of $500 billion. Now, to a country that's already $1 trillion in debt, some people went, you know what, big price to pay. Now, I get it, we are part of the world, but we are 1% of the world's problem. So despite the fact that that was a lie, an absolutely provable lie, when it's the Labor Party, they don't count. The gallery never want to follow up on it. It's just a right-wing talking point from those kooks who want to hold us to account. So you would have thought that that would have been a definitive issue, just like there'll be no carbon tax under a government I lead, back from 2010 in the 2012 politics that led to the 2013 rubbishing of the Labor government. Oh, no. Instead, this one, despite the fact that they lied like that, they didn't just win, they won even bigger in 2025. And this time, they had an incredible strategy, which was, yes, we are going to up the current 43% to maybe 50, maybe 60, maybe 75, which will cost a whole lot more money, and there'll be plenty more in the cost of transition. But don't expect us to have an answer. Let's just make one up about what the Liberals are going to do. And guess what? It worked.
Find $600 billion for nuclear reactors. Of course, Peter Dutton needs to find $600 billion to pay for nuclear reactors. This is the mob that want to cut everything to pay for $600 billion of their nuclear reactors. Coalition that will cut Medicare as sure as night follows day, because they've got to find $600 billion for their nuclear fantasy.
Now, the media knew it was a lie, but they kept propagating it. They never confronted. They never turned around and went, OK, look, are you going to tell the same lie every day for the 5 weeks of this campaign? Oh, no, they just let it run and let it run and let it run. And then it got hammered and hammered and hammered on social media. And yet they won. Because surprise, surprise, if no one's going to stand in front of the lie and no one's going to push back and the media's not going to let anyone get out of first gear who's going to disrupt the system as it currently is, guess what? People fall for it. Well, a decision does have to be made in this parliamentary term about what will the next round of climate change targets be. Remember, Australia is 1% of the world's problem. They passed a law to say we will reduce by 2030 by 43% of 1% of the world's problems. Well, in 2035, the United Nations would like us to go even further. Despite the fact that we are, I repeat, 1% of the world's problem, they think that if we can get to 100% of 1% of the world's problem, then apparently bushfires will never happen again. He says with tongue-in-cheek before somebody writes some long-worded legal complaint. Now, the Greens, their position is that we go from 43 to 100% by 2035. The Teals say we go from 43% to 75% by 2035. And given that the government only needs the Greens to get anything done, the negotiating level is somewhere between 75 and 100. All right? That's to get it through the Parliament. Well, today, I am very pleased to say that the Business Council of Australia, the same ones who turned around and said that an economic wrecking ball would be the consequences of what Shorten was suggesting in 2019. But because they wanted to get in with the new broom, they literally dropped that analysis and stood in the room while the Prime Minister ended up signing what has now become the law, the 43% of 1%. Well, they put out a report on the weekend which now says that Australia will need up to $530 billion in investment in new infrastructure, technology and skills if it is a chance of achieving a 70% reduction of 1% of the world's problems by 2035. So remember, for $600 billion, which was a made-up number, garbage number, no proof in the number whatsoever, that was apparently going to be cuts in Medicare. That was the reason why, little old ladies were going to cry themselves to sleep at night, why children wouldn't be able to learn their times tables, why it will rain all day, every day, but not really in the places that it needs to rain, which means we'll be both in flood and drought at the same time because we haven't done enough about 1% of the world's problems. Well, let me take you through the different stages of the cost of transition. The only debate I've ever had in the history of this program, all right? All I ever want is people to be honest. And while some may say that horse is bolted, and who cares, the government is handsomely re-elected, 2/3 of Australian politics is absolutely certain that we need to do even more on 1% of the world's problems, while China can cough, and that's our emissions, in just 16 days, they are able to replace the entirety of Australia's 1% of the world's problem. But shh, don't upset China. Don't upset China. We all know what that'll do in certain seats. We continue. Australia's 2030 target is a 43% reduction on emissions from 2005. A 50% target for the 2035 number would cost $210 billion, with the reductions coming from the electricity and energy sector. Now, the funny thing is, once you start to step higher, it's not just about the power grid. To achieve a 60% cut, the heavy industry, resources, transport and building sectors would have to do substantially more to reduce their emissions. And agriculture would have to start to move as well. In this scenario, an additional 59,000 workers will be needed in electrical trades and engineering in the next 5 years alone. So, of course, that means more immigration. Why? Because there are not 59,000 people that are ready to go in the next couple of years. While total investment required in the economy would be somewhere between $395 and $480 billion. So remember, the Teals, 75%, the Greens, 100%. A 70% or higher cut to 1% of the world's problems would cost up to $530 billion. All sectors having to take on a bigger share of reductions, which would likely require explicit consumer behaviour changes. No more meat. We'll tell you when you can put the air conditioning on. You know, all this sort of stuff. And of course, it's ludicrous to suggest now. But these are the types of things that will be put on the table. And because the first AMBIT claim is so ridiculous, if they get 3/4 of crazy, they'll consider it a win and your life's going to change. Elections have consequences. And I know if you watch this show that you are probably someone who wasn't all that excited with the conclusion of the 2025 election. But all those people who understandably fire up about the cost of living, guess what gets worse the higher we tick these things up? Guess who pays? You, the consumer, or you, the taxpayer, via the government. And they will say nothing to see here. Time to move on. Stop with the knuckle dragging. Now, the reality is that you can be a person who understands Australia is part of a global community and has to do something quite significant to get ourselves to, say, net zero by 2050. Or you could be one of those people who says, no, none of that net zero stuff because we're 1% of the world's problems. Cool. But what you can't be is somebody who wants us to get to 50%, to 60%, 75%, or 90% or 100% and pretend that there are no consequences for 27 million people who live in the country, for the people who work in industries that will either stop giving pay rises because there's not as much money. Why? Because the cost of compliance is there. Or as certain industries just fade away because they're yesterday's news. And the people pushing all of this are going to pretend that somebody who's a truck driver in country Queensland is somehow going to become an AI king in a calendar year. This will be as disruptive to the Australian economy as the moves in the 90s and the early 2000s were towards the globalisation of the Australian economy, when manufacturing just disappeared because it was cheaper to do it somewhere else. The cost of transition is the only issue that matters when you were discussing, yes, that Australia must do something because it is part of a globe, but the idea that even if we do everything and we bankrupt or super tax or hold back the actual sources of revenue to the government, then the government will have to continue spending because that's what the population has come to demand. But where does the funds come from? Even if they find their local billionaire, turn them upside down and shake them until the bullion falls from their pockets, there'll still be a credit card. And as you know, the budget deficit will be there for the next 40 years. And currently $1 trillion is what Australia owes the world. With this stuff, so we feel good about doing our bit around 1%, and we can host conferences here where none of the people in attendance get screwed over. Yet the members of the public who pay for the conference that might be happening in Adelaide to set new targets, the ones who don't fly, they could be in a world of trouble. But is the reality that there's a certain level of trouble people are willing to accept? Well, presumably that's the case after the last election. Or was it that there was an absolute commitment amongst those who discuss politics to never discuss the cost of transition, instead make up the cost of transition about the other guy, while never having to own what your plan was? What your plan was, what the consequences would be, what the financial consequences would be for the everyday Australian. Can you know what you think about that or anything else? You can send me an email, paul@skynews.com.au. Now, as we know, the passions that run deep, and understandably so, that we have seen in our country for the past couple of years have reignited after the terrorist attacks of October the 7th a couple of years ago. Barbarous, disgusting things done by Hamas. Yet people, the day after, rather than rallying around the victims, instead tried to intimidate the victims by going to the site of where they were going to light the Sydney Harbour Bridge up with the Israeli flag, for it was their citizens who had been through a tragedy. Nothing happened. A protest across the bridge 2 years later helped the Prime Minister decide there is a side to pick here, and he has picked it, and he believes it to be the right one. Many do not. That has now resulted in plenty more people who are planning to have marches across the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So the Opera House and the bridge, two symbols which have constantly been how Australia has marketed itself to the rest of the world, have been tainted by this debate. They are not symbols of Australia. They are now symbols of Australia that have an asterisk as people with very strong feelings have had their say about what's happening on the other side of the world. Well, when it comes to Sydney, Bondi Beach, next on the list. And guess what happened today? A collection of people who claim to be those that are more compassionate than others got into a fight with the very people who are not part of the Israeli government, who are not signed up and parts of the parliament, who may well have had family or friends hurt or killed or captured a couple of years ago. No, let's bang our heads together and let's have another fight in another icon. If we keep this up, we're going to sort of run out of places to do this. After you've done the Opera House and you've done the bridge, you've done Bondi Beach, I don't know. Do we have to rebuild the monorail so they can go back in time and have these constant clashes of good and evil? Again, I understand all of the passion. I understand all of the detail. I'm very clear about what happened and what has happened since. But I've got to say I have a certain frustration, a wariness, dare I say, that every single weekend we have this, because it then starts a conversation that goes for another few days, and a week that we should have spent talking about what is happening here, we end up talking about what is happening here because of what is happening there. Here's some of the people who were on the beach today wanting to push back against Israel. And here are some of the people who were saying, no, eastern suburbs of Sydney, this is where we live, and you are clearly here as some sort of a form of intimidation. And here they are. Remember the counter-protest, which is standing up to the original protest. This is what happens in Melbourne all the time. Well, now it happened in Sydney. What is that term that the Prime Minister, to be honest, I'd heard it, but I'd never heard it sort of mainlined into the front and centre about the only way Australia can be peaceful is if, what is this term that is used over and over and over again?
Social cohesion. Social cohesion. Social cohesion. Social cohesion. Social cohesion. Social cohesion. Social cohesion.
No, I know exactly what it means. But also, it's one of those sort of wank words, right? Forgive me, Sunday, Father's Day. But, you know, that sort of corporate speak, that university speak, that sort of, dare I say, HR speak, where, okay, I know what you're talking about, but it's a step down from saying Australian values, national values. It's a step down from saying, I get it, but that's there, this is here, and while here is peaceful and there is no consequence, generally speaking, to expressing how you feel about what's happening over there, we're here. But we're at that stage, like this conflict has forever been and forever probably will be, where there's always some new motivation to become part of this. Now, the Prime Minister has been the Prime Minister the whole time during this. All of the significant leaders have been the same leaders the whole time through this. And of course, being politicians, they want to win as many seats as possible, which means we've got to balance it a little bit. We've got to not, there's more here and not enough, and I don't know. They traditionally and we, But for everyone else in the country, wouldn't you like a leader to speak with clarity about saying, look, cool, I get it, but not this weekend. I get it, just a little bit. I look forward to the hate, inevitably, for me even beginning to say something like this. But there is a frustration amongst the rest of the population that and yes, I am very, very aware of the luxury that we have to live in the peace that we do. That means we have the luxury to say, okay, I get it. But I honestly think that is how the majority of Australians feel. They may have an opinion about the conflict, they may have an opinion about what they think should happen next, but the idea that all day, every day, the only thing... Am I alone in that? I don't know. Send me an email. Complain, agree, whatever. paul@skynews.com.au. Now, while I'm on a roll of upsetting people, let us have a chat about a couple of articles that popped up this weekend regarding the leadership of Susan Lee as the leader of the opposition. Now, I know that there is a certain section of people who would not like Susan Lee to be the leader. In fact, obviously, there was another candidate in Angus Taylor who put himself up to be the leader of the opposition. But in a very tight vote, and again, who knows if that vote happened again, because a couple of the people have left the parliament, one never made it to the... Who knows? But already we are seeing stuff like this. Now, there has been only one round of polling post the last federal election. I think there's been less than a month of sitting days in the parliament. Yet, James Campbell, again, writing quite correctly about the noise. The moment she stumbles, the knives will be out for Susan Lee. The Sydney Morning Herald, Lee promised a new coalition with a new tone, but she's been sabotaged by her own side. It's all a way of digging out Jacinta Nampijinpa Price, and of course all of that is payback for her standing in the way of what they all declared to be the only way to vote a couple of years ago. But there is something, regardless of whom is the leader of the opposition, that people do need to accept. To become the government, you need 76 seats in the parliament, all right? We don't have non-compulsory voting like they have in the UK or the United States, and we don't have statewide voting for the president like they have in the United States. We have 76 seats that you need to win the majority of first and second and third preferences to become the government. And a very significant population is the Indian population in Australia. Now, their values seemingly align with many of those that would be traditionally the Liberal Party, which is why, in part, Susan Lee is trying to say, well, we know they didn't vote for us last time, so maybe if they get to know me, they change their opinion next time.
I know that as leader, the most important message that I can send is that appreciation of our Indian community, heard directly from me as leader.
And again, regardless of how you feel about anyone in Australian politics, right? You could be, I hate them all, I'm not going to vote for any of them, right? Here's the deal. If you've got hundreds of thousands of voters, and apparently 85% of the hundreds of thousands of voters didn't vote for you, well, then that's probably something you want to change in the future if you have any interest in getting to 76 seats, if you want to come from the left or from the right. We spoke about it with Kos Samaras, the man we spoke to all the way in the lead up, in the many, many weeks and months before the election, who was there when the Libs were way in front, all the way down to when Labor ended up being way in front. And he told us about this diaspora. Why? Because he talks to them.
A lot of these, particularly younger Indian Australians, when we speak to them, they explain to us all these values that we just touched on. And we ask them the question, well, you should be voting Liberal. Why aren't you voting Liberal? And they said, well, because they don't like us.
Wow.
It's as simple as that.
That's extraordinary to hear, right? Because many people of the Indian community in Australia, they're always quite warm to the values that we share, the conversations we have on this show, talk a lot about how they share things in and around the community. But hey, data don't lie. And the data is what COS is showing there, right? So obviously you want to turn that around. And the same again with Chinese voters in Australia. Multiple seats, including the former one of John Howard in Bennelong. Now a very significant number of those people are Chinese Australian voters. And the Chinese Australian leadership says that locals don't like the way that people talk about the CCP. They don't like how they talk about Beijing. They think it's a personal attack, even though I think all of that is revved up by the Labor Party. But still, here's the point. If it's about purity tests of how left or how right somebody is, you're going to get yourself into trouble. Equally, if you don't stand for anything, no one's going to come to your side. I get all of that. But the only way to stop what is happening in Australia, if you don't like what's happening in Australia, is to convince enough people to change their opinion so that 76 seats in the parliament at the first available opportunity will end up in a place other than where they are right now. And that includes all Australians with all histories. Again, it's not about purity tests. Don't get angry at me. But that's the reality, right? For want of a better term, our side of the argument, and by that I don't mean the Liberal Party, I just mean our side of the argument, does need to dig into the data, dig into the census, get to know communities, broaden our view and about whom we talk to and what they hear, not just, hey, you agree, right? Doesn't work like that. Right, can you know what you think about that or anything else? Send me an email, paul@skynews.com.au.